सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The first quarter data for the finances of the center and the states are now with us. And it's important to look at it because now this is the first quarter of the pre-election year. This entire year is going to inform us about how various governments at the state level and at the center are dealing with their finances, especially their expenditure right before the general elections next year in May. So that's what we're going to analyze in this episode of Macrosutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and we have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP. Thank you, Radhika, for joining us.
Thank you, Sharad.
Now, Radhika, the first question that we need to ask is that it's only one quarter's data that we have so far.
Yeah.
Is it enough for us to make some sort of guesses about the year?
Yeah, so it's the first quarter and we can get some early indications about the likely trajectory of the both taxes as well as expenditures in the coming quarters. At least we get some sense of what could be the possible challenges that may emerge in the coming quarters that need to be managed. So though it is premature to make assumptions or inferences only on the basis of the first quarter result, but they do tell us something about the early indications about the trajectory, particularly also so because we compare this with the corresponding quarter of last year.
Right.
So we are comparing the same period of 2 years and then we are making some analysis or assumptions or inferences about the trajectory of what's happening to taxes, what's happening to expenditures, deficits, whether deficit is more this time around as compared to what happened in the same quarter of last year,
Right.
what's happening to taxes, are they strong enough as compared to the same quarter last year?
Mm-hmm.
So this we are comparing like to like, and therefore it is okay to just mull over both central and state finances for the first quarter. So in that way it is instructive, but only on the basis of first quarter we cannot make guesses about whether, if we are asked whether central government will be able to achieve its fiscal deficit target of 5.9%.
Right, of course.
There are some challenges that we are seeing in the first quarter, but it is quite possible that there could be reprioritization and then government is able to achieve. But yes, it's telling us something about the finances and how they fare as compared to the same quarter of last year.
Right. So it's more or less like a marathon. So if you see the first quarter of the marathon, it will not obviously tell you fully about how the marathon is going to turn out. But you can see that if one runner has started off slow, then at least that much you can tell that this runner has started off slow, which means that in the next 3/4 of the marathon, they're going to have to make up in that regard.
Yeah, same. I mean, other expenditures need to catch up. Same is the case for states also, that we get some indications about some states doing well, some states not doing well.
Right.
What could be the policy challenges, particularly for those states that are not doing well. So in that way, it's a useful exercise to look at the first quarter numbers.
Right. So now you were talking about challenges, and from your article, I can tell one challenge definitely seems to be revenues.
Right.
So can you tell us a little more about how the center's tax revenues have performed, even non-tax, and the same for the states as well?
Yes. So if we look at the receipts, so if we'll just look at the structure of the finances, we have the receipts, which includes tax revenue, non-tax revenue, and capital receipts, which are non-debt creating.
Right.
So we are not including borrowings, because borrowings are something that are used to bridge the fiscal deficit.
Right.
So we are including tax revenue, non-tax revenue, and non-debt creating capital receipts. So these are the three components that we analyze in the receipts budget of the central government. And if we look at this, the most dominant part is, of course, the tax revenues.
Right.
And here we see that the gross tax revenue, which is on a gross basis before the devolution of taxes to the states, that is called gross tax revenue, that has registered a very meager growth of 3%.
Oh, that's it.
So in over the corresponding quarter of last year.
Right.
Whereas in the same quarter of last year, it had registered a growth of more than 20%. So there has been a slowdown in gross tax revenues of central government. Gross tax revenues in Q1 of the current financial year grew by just 3% over the Q1 of 2022-23.
Right.
Now, if we look at a breakup of the taxes, there are some taxes that have done well. There are some taxes that have not done well. So let us look at taxes that have not done well. It's mainly the corporation taxes that have registered a contraction as compared to the same quarter of last year.
They're less this
They
year.
are less this
than
year
last
as
year.
compared to the Q1 of 2022-23.
Okay.
And that is a very interesting as well as a conflicting, a challenging thing which everybody is trying to grapple with, trying to understand why this is the case. Because if we look at the listed companies' performance in terms of profits, the profit before tax on which corporation tax is levied, profit before tax have been at record high and they have registered a growth of 29%. So when profits are growing, what could be the possible reason of a contraction in corporation tax? That is something which needs to be analyzed. And there could be two possible explanations. One is that while overall the profit before tax have registered a growth of 29%, there are sectoral variations which are masked by this headline number.
Yeah.
So if we look at the major tax-paying sectors, for example, the oil sector and the IT sector, their profits are not that high because for oil, it is mainly due to the decline in commodity prices. And for IT, we've always discussed that it's due to the subdued global demand.
Right.
So the profits are muted, relatively muted, less than expectations. So
And these
that
are
is-
the big tax-paying sectors.
these are the big tax-paying sectors. So that is one reason why while on an aggregate basis we get high profits, but in terms of when they translate into corporation tax, the revenues have contracted by 14%.
I see.
So that is one major challenge, because if we look at the budget of this financial year, the budget has projected a growth of 10.5% of corporate tax. Now, if in the first quarter we are getting a contraction of 14%, it does create challenges for the 3 quarters. We need to see what happens to the trajectory of corporation tax in these 3 quarters. And if commodity prices continue to moderate, it will have an impact on the profitability of the high-paying sectors, and maybe corporation tax goes down further. So we need to see what happens in the quarter. So that is one very insightful aspect that we are able to get from the quarterly numbers.
Right.
Yeah.
And income tax?
Income tax have done well. Personal income tax collection have grown at double digit, 11%, but still lower than the first quarter of last year, because there was a 40% growth in Q1 of 2022-23. This time it is 11%, though it is a growth, but corporation tax registered a contraction. So personal income tax, GST collection and custom duties have registered a growth of double digits, whereas excise duty collections and corporation tax have registered a contraction.
So this is not really then a commentary on economic activity, because if GST collections are going up, income taxes are going up, then it's down to what you had said, which is that the tax-paying sectors are not doing that well.
Yes. So, and similarly for excise duties also, it depends a lot on the windfall tax that are imposed on the crude oil, and windfall tax did come down during the April to June quarter. So that is getting reflected in the excise duty collection. So it has a lot to do with the decline in commodity prices. In fact, those sectors that benefited the most last year from surge in commodity prices will now see a normalization, because now global commodity prices have come down. So they will now see a normalization in these quarters, because they have seen a spike in profits last year. So it's also base effect. It's also the fact that now they are normalizing. It's not that they're going down, but it's the spike that we saw, it's getting normalized in the subsequent quarters. So
Right. And so that's tax revenue.
right.
And that's for the center. Now, what about non-tax revenue? Even though it's a smaller chunk,
Yeah.
how has that been doing?
So there we have good news, because non-tax revenues, even just in the first quarter, the central government has managed to achieve more than 50% of its budgeted non-tax revenue.
Oh, wow.
So 51% of the budgeted non-tax revenue has already been achieved in the first quarter.
Right.
And it's mainly due to the surplus transfer from the Reserve Bank of India. So
Right.
Reserve Bank has transferred 87,000 crore as surplus dividends to central government, and that is one of the major source of non-tax revenues for the central government, which last year was 30,000 crore. Now it is 87,000 crore. So it is giving kind of a comfort. It helps in easing the worries on the tax front. So if
Right.
there could be possible slippages on tax revenue front, we do have some comfort from non-tax revenues, because we've already achieved more than half of the budgeted in the first quarter itself.
Right. So now, the fact that the central tax revenue hasn't done that well, does that then impact the states and their tax revenues?
So as of now, we have seen the state's tax revenues have done well, because one of the main reason is that there are two concepts. One is gross tax revenue and the other is net tax revenue of the central government. So what is the difference? Net tax revenue is after the state's share has been devolved to the states.
Right.
So we know that Finance Commission decides how much of the proportion of central government tax has to be given or devolved to the states. So, and that amount is, for this financial year, it is rupees 10 lakh crore.
Okay.
And what center normally does is that it gives this in 14 equal installments across the year.
Right.
And normally, so in 1 month, you will have double, because twice it has to happen. And normally this doubling happens towards the end of the year, when the government is quite sure about its tax revenues, its inflows. But this time around, the government has already offloaded that in June itself.
I see.
So in June, the central government had done the devolution twice. That means that out of 10 lakh crore, 3 lakh crore has already been given to the states. So that is one reason that states' tax revenue, that is one reason. It's not the only reason, but yes, that is one reason states have got their share of central taxes. But overall, also states' tax revenues have done well in this first quarter as compared to the corresponding quarter of last year. On average, most of the states have been able to spend 20%, 21% of their budgeted target in the first quarter itself. The only exception is Bihar, where they have spent only 4% of the budgeted target in the first quarter. So that is
only 4%.
4% has been garnered. So in rest of the states, 20% of tax revenue has been achieved, mopped up in the first quarter. It's only Bihar which is doing badly in terms of tax revenue collections.
Okay, and is that also because the own tax revenues of the state are suffering?
Yeah, own tax revenues are suffering, and they are a lot. So if we look at the composition of taxes, there is the own tax revenue and state's share in central taxes. And this is despite getting a greater proportion of central taxes that they are, their mop up in the first quarter is quite small, which means that they are reliant on central devolution, and by themselves, their own tax revenue has not been picking up well.
I see. And so that's on the revenue side. Now, on the expenditure side, the government has been pushing on capital expenditure now for a few years. So in the first quarter, do we see that this push is still continuing?
Yes, this push is still continuing. And in fact, there's a 59% increase as compared to the corresponding quarter of last year. That means in April to June of this year, central government has spent 59% more than what it spent in the Q1 of 2022-23. even last year they had spent 50, the growth was 57%. So what we are seeing is that capex push is still continuing, and that is getting reflected in improvement in the expenditure mix of the government, because the emphasis is on improving the quality of expenditure by spending more on capex rather than revenue expenditure,
which is like build more roads and buildings and bridges,
have more multiplier effect, generating employment. So all these things are still continuing, and that is visible in the first quarter itself, where the central government has spent 28% of its budgeted target in the first quarter itself.
Okay, that's not bad. So 28% in 25% of the time.
Yeah,
that's pretty
so
good.
Which is better than what they did in the first quarter of last year. At that time, they had spent 23%. This time, they have spent more than 28%.
Right.
So the push on capex is continuing for the central government, and correspondingly, revenue expenditure has been flattish. So there is no change in growth rate between the two quarters, the first quarter of 2022-23 and first quarter of 23-24.
And revenue expenditure would be salaries, pensions,
pensions, subsidies, interest payments. Right. So on the revenue expenditure, the growth has been flat. So the revenue expenditure in this quarter, April to June of this year and April to June of the last financial year, are more or less same. There is no growth. In fact, there is a slight contraction. So this shows that the expenditure mix is clearly moving in favor of capital expenditure for the central government.
So then can we tie this a little bit to the to politics and the upcoming elections, where so it looks like the government, at least in the first quarter, has not gone in for more subsidies, increasing salaries or increasing pensions. It's focused more on asset creation and capital creation.
Yes. So we are now seeing some challenges. So let's see how it shapes up in the coming quarters, because there could be some upside risks to revenue expenditure. One such risk is allocation to the Rural Jobs Guarantee Scheme, the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, on which, if we remember, the allocation in this year's budget was slashed.
Yes.
Last year it was 73,000 crore. In this year's budget, the government came under criticism also that they have slashed the allocation for Rural Jobs Guarantee Program to 60,000 crore.
Right.
And if we look at the data till now, which comes from the dashboard of the Manrega website, we see that more than half has already been dispersed in just 4 months of the current financial year. So that means that demand for work is still elevated under Manrega. And one of the reasons for this is the uneven rainfall, delayed sowing.
Right.
So therefore, people shifted to Manrega for job opportunities, and the central government had to disperse more funds. So if they have already spent more than 50% in first 4 months, there could be a situation where they would have to increase the allocation to the Rural Jobs Guarantee Scheme.
Right, and Manrega anyway is a demand-driven scheme. So as much demand as there is, the government has to provide it.
Yes. So that is one possible risk that could lead to possible slippages on the revenue expenditure front. Because again, if we remember, in the budget, they have just targeted a modest growth of 1.4% in revenue expenditure.
Right.
Very small growth in revenue expenditure. So there could be some deviation on that account. That is number one. The other is inflation. And in the pre-election year, high inflation, high food inflation. So if the government intervenes aggressively through supply side measures, that could again have fiscal implications. So if the government reduces the import duties, it imports more, that could have implications on our custom duty collection. If fertilizer prices go up, if the government decides to pay more fertilizer subsidy, again there could be some possible slippages on the revenue expenditure. So the impact of inflation, both domestic as well as global headwinds, could impose some challenges on the revenue expenditure front. One due to the jobs guarantee program, and the other due to the supply side intervention that the government might have to do.
Even the free food that they're giving right now, the 5 kgs of free food grain, if the price of wheat starts going up too high, then government has to buy it before it gives it to people, right? So if it's buying at a high price and giving it for free, then that cost is borne by the government.
By the government, and now it is reported that they are going to they are considering importing wheat from Russia at discounted prices. So all these supply side interventions would have a bearing on both the central government finances and the state government finances, and this is very critical in a pre-election year because inflation tends to become a pain point. Particularly food inflation, it harms the poor. We have already seen the cost of food items going up, the cost of thali going up. So that will have an impact on fiscal if the central government and the states decide to intervene.
Right. And so now we've spoken about revenue and expenditure of the center. So how are they looking on the fiscal deficit, which is basically the difference between the two?
Yeah, so fiscal deficit has widened in the first quarter to 25%. It's slightly more than what we saw in the same quarter of last year. It was 22%. Yeah, it is due to the subdued tax revenue.
The revenue, right.
Yeah, so it's because tax revenues are one of the major drivers of bridging the fiscal deficit gap. And this time around, the tax revenue collections have been relatively subdued. It's getting translated into higher fiscal deficit. Also because capex, the central government has not compromised. So that is also one reason that slightly there has been a deviation from the fiscal deficit, and we have already achieved 25% of fiscal deficit target in the first quarter.
Right. So, I mean, it's a simple math, right? If you're spending more and earning less, then your deficit is going to widen. So now we spoke about the capex of the center, but a lot of states have also promised a lot of capex over the years. What is the Q1 data showing? Are the states keeping up to their promises?
There is so overall, if we see on an aggregate basis, there has been a 75% jump in capital expenditure from the first quarter of last year to the first quarter of this year.
That's more than even the center.
Yes, that's more than even the center. But there are wide disparities within the states, and there are few states that have driven this massive surge in capital expenditures. One noteworthy state in this regard is Andhra Pradesh. Andhra Pradesh was a laggard last year, in the sense that it spent only, in the entire year, it spent only 23% of its budgeted capex. It actually spent only 23%. And this time, just in the first quarter, they have spent more than 40%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that is one reason that has given a sharp impetus, overall sharp jump to the capital expenditure of, so we look at 19 major states that have, for whom the data is available in the CAG website, the monthly reports that come out, and our analysis shows that there is a 75% jump, which is driven by few handful of states. Most of the states have seen a positive rise, but there are few states like Himachal Pradesh, Karnataka, that have actually registered a decline in the first quarter of this financial year as compared to the first quarter of last year.
So Himachal, could it be because of the rains?
Yes, could be. And Karnataka, we know that they have promised a lot of freebies, and they made this statement publicly that capex would be suffering. So that is one reason that it's also getting reflected in the data in terms of how much they have spent in the first quarter. There also Karnataka, Maharashtra, these are some of the states that have been laggards. They have spent only a very small proportion of their budgeted amount in the first quarter.
Right. And so now we have some questions from the audience. Some of them have to do directly with the topic. Some are more related to state finances and how inflation affects them. So one is to do with the inflation data. They ask, recent inflation data shows wide variation across states, which is something, by the way, we've talked about in a previous Macrosutra episode. With Rajasthan experiencing the highest inflation and Delhi being the lowest. To what extent is this based on local issues, or how much is this driven by local policies? And is this differential range normal?
It is normal because, as we've talked about, there is wide variation in states' inflation, not only amongst the states, but also between rural and urban. sometimes we see that the rural inflation is much higher and urban inflation is within reasonable limits, and sometimes it is just the opposite, where rural inflation is higher and urban inflation is lower. It's subdued. It is rightfully said that there is some of the local policies are to explain for this. One of this is differential VAT, value added tax.
Yes.
That will, when the states have different VAT, that will have an implication on the fuel CPI, and therefore on the other components that depend on fuel. So that will have an implication. The other thing has to do with the PDS policy. What is the coverage of public distribution system in a state? There are some states that cover a lot of commodities within PDS. There are some states that have very narrow coverage of PDS. So that also determines food inflation in different states, which will again have an implication on the finances, because if you are giving a lot of subsidies and you have a wider coverage of subsidies through the PDS, the state financial will definitely take a hit. So those are some of the local policies. But this time around, if we particularly look at June and July data, it's mainly driven by food inflation.
Yes.
It's mainly driven by uneven distribution of rainfall, the fact that we have some states that have experienced drought. There are some states that have experienced excessive rainfall, crop wastage, and crops getting spoiled. So that is one of the reasons that we are seeing a very wide range of inflation across states.
But in general, it is normal. As we've talked about before.
Yeah, it is normal. There are local policies to that explain the differential. There are the production patterns are different. Particularly in Rajasthan, spices inflation matter a lot, because their spices is a major item in their consumption, and they are the producers of spices also. So if they make some change in the production pattern, that will get reflected in spice inflation. So in that way, each state has its own story regarding inflation. But in general, the PDS policies, the VAT policies, these are some of the things that impact state inflation. But this time it's mainly driven by the food inflation and how vegetable prices have played up in different parts of the states.
So we have, you'd mentioned Karnataka, and we have one question on Karnataka, which is it possible for the Karnataka government to manage its finances without affecting its developmental projects?
Yeah, so it is going to be a challenge, given that it's promised a lot on freebies after the election, and that is getting reflected in the first quarter finances also, where as we discussed that they have spent very little on capex in this first quarter, which is kind of exception, because most states are doing well on capex, but Karnataka is one state. 2-3 more states, but Karnataka is one state which is showing a very small increase in capital expenditure in this quarter as compared to what they did in the corresponding quarter of last year. So that is...
It was a different government.
There was a different government. So we are seeing this getting reflected. We need to see how what happens in the remaining quarters. But yes, if we just look at first quarter, we do see that these challenging signs are emerging.
Right. And now our final question, which doesn't really have to do with state finances, but it might impact it. The Deputy CM of Bihar is talking about reservations in the private sector. Is Bihar prepared for another flight of capital? So they're asking that this reservation policy will lead companies to not invest in the state.
Yes. So this is a challenge that Bihar has to grapple, and that is, we've talked about the state finances in a number of episodes, and Bihar has always been a challenging state in terms of finances, in terms of its fiscal deficit, in terms of the variations between the budget estimate, revised estimates, and actuals. We've already seen Bihar emerging as a problematic example of disturbance and variations in the fiscal parameters, and which is also reflected in the the finances of the current first quarter, where we see that they are not able to garner a lot of tax revenues, which would ultimately impact their fiscal deficit, because as per the Finance Commission, all states have to now move towards a fiscal consolidation roadmap. They have to follow their state's FRBM. They have to move to a 3% fiscal deficit target. But if in the first quarter they have managed to garner only 4% of the budgeted target of tax revenue, that is going to be a challenge, and therefore they have to consider their policies in a way that it doesn't come in the way of further slowing down their tax revenues. So they have to have more investment-friendly policies rather than have policies that will lead to flight of capital, which will ultimately have a bearing on tax revenues.
Right. So there you go. Now, overall, the center's revenues aren't looking that great in the first quarter. Especially corporate revenue has fallen. It's actually contracted. And income tax seems to be doing okay. But on the other side, in terms of expenditure, the quality of expenditure seems to be much better. They're spending more on capital expenditure, whereas what they're spending on revenue expenditure, which is salaries, pensions, interest payments on loans and subsidies, that has remained more or less flat. And that is quite telling in a pre-election year, that the government it's doubling down on capital expenditure. It is not going for freebies. There are some risks that later on in the year, revenue expenditure might increase, but at least in the first quarter, government policy seems to be in creating more assets rather than giving more subsidies, increasing salaries, that kind of thing. The states, on their part, their capital expenditure in total has increased, but that's being driven by some states rather than all states. And in terms of revenue as well, there's an uneven performance where you can see that a lot of states are increasingly dependent on the center for the devolution rather than bringing up revenue of their own.
Right.
So now that's the picture that we have in Q1, and this gives us some indication of what the year is going to look at. Obviously, we can't predict what the full year is going to be, but it gives us a nice little picture. And on that note, thank you so much for watching.